Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live discussion on the history of solar geoengineering. I'm Mark Turner, comms lead at SRM360, and I'm really looking forward to this one, learning about what our panelists see as the key moments that define this evolving field. We've also put together a timeline of our own, published on our website this week, so please do check that out online, and please feel free to share your thoughts with us on that one. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go along. Not the chat, but the dedicated Q&A option so we can keep track. And please do keep your questions short and focused on the topic at hand. Dave Levitan, our lead writer, will direct some of those questions to panel members towards the end of the session. So thank you again for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Over to you, Pete.
Well, thank you, Mark. As there's so much to cover, let me just jump straight in and introduce our panelists. We have Oliver Morton, a science writer and editor, currently at The Economist and previously at the scientific journal Nature. He has written extensively about solar geoengineering, including in his seminal 2016 book, The Planet Remade, and is the chair of the board for the Degrees Initiative. And we have Sikina Jinnah, a professor of environmental studies and the Robert Headley Presidential Chair in Integral Ecology and Environmental Justice at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She is the author and/or editor of 7 books, including most recently, Building Capacity for Public Engagement on Solar Geoengineering. And we have David Keith, a professor of geophysical science and founding faculty director of the Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago, who previously led the development of Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. David has authored more than 200 academic publications and the book, A Case for Climate Engineering. So Ollie, let me start with you. Is the idea of deliberately modifying the climate a new idea? Could you talk a little bit about the prehistory of climate science and how it connects to this notion?
Well, you answered the question for me, Pete, which was yes, it's an idea with a rich and interesting prehistory. I think a couple of strands to bring out. One is that we have to remember that until relatively recently, there wasn't much consideration of a global climate. And so modifying the climate was seen as a regional sort of occupation. And also that it was very strongly imbued with ideas about colonialism and about the right use of things. And so one of the claims made about changing the climate throughout the Enlightenment is that the presence of white settlers in America is changing the climate, and that is good. And that is a work of sort of like providence. And similarly, you see this in North Africa in the 19th century, that the French claim that the reason the climate in North Africa is bad is because the natives have made it bad and the French can restore it to what it used to be as the grain basket of Rome. And so these ideas of changing climates are almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely responses to political and cultural ideas. That changes a bit in the end of the 19th century, I think largely because of the understanding of the Earth as a system of systems in and of itself. And, you know, this is a history that's very beautifully drawn in Sarah Dry's book, The Waters of the Earth. And the idea that the system changes, that there are ice ages, that the climate all around the world changes in a synchronized way, that leads people to think, well, maybe humans can change the climate. And the person that we think of most here is Svante Arrhenius, who calculates the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide and notes that in time, this will start changing the climate. And for him, that's not unintentional. That's quite possibly a good thing, not least because he lives in Scandinavia. And there's one other thing from around that time I'd like to point to, which is slightly offbeat, but I think actually quite interesting, which is the idea of the canals of Mars. When people look at Mars in the late 19th century under the influence of Percival Lowell, they see a planet which they understand to be being engineered by intelligent people. That the Martians are re-engineering their climate because their climate is turning into a desert. And this is seen as a very normal sort of thing. I mean, it's extraordinary because it's about Martians and stuff, but it's not seen as unlikely that people might try to change the climate. And there's a very interesting history, some of which is in my book and some of which I think still needs to be written, about the degree to which, as climate change becomes a real thing in the world, an everyday but somewhat ludic discourse about engineering the climate becomes increasingly marginalized.
And sorry, what does ludic mean there?
Playful.
Playful.
You read these things. I mean, I remember digging up the papers of George Thomson in Cambridge, who wrote about the possibility of cooling the Earth with stratospheric aerosols in the 1950s. And it's clear that he was just, messing around with the numbers. He was saying, if we could do this, we could do that. And it's sort of like thought experimenty. Like ideas of sort of like cutting off the Gulf Stream to spite the English and things like that. It's not serious, but it's not entirely fantastical. It's got sort of like scientific underpinning.
Well,
Pete, could I take us to the 1950s?
please.
Yeah, when I was first really kind of looking at the history, I was very struck by the way that things emerged right after the war. So Langmuir and Schaefer started this silver iodide cloud seeding in 46, if I remember right. And then there was very quickly a wild commercial boom in weather control in the US with a huge number of kind of unlicensed fly-by-night or fly-by-day mostly operators in small planes supposedly bringing rain to farmers. Presumably very little of it actually did anything. But people knew that there would be this rob Peter to pay Paul phenomena that if you have winds blowing in one direction and you make it rain one place, then the downstream farmer is likely to get less rain. So there were a whole enormous number of lawsuits and concerns. And in response to that, Congress created the Advisory Committee on Weather Control in 1953. And I think of that, I've dabbled in this. I'd like a real intellectual historian to look at it, but I think of that as in some ways the beginning of the modern professional look at climate and weather. Because if you look at the membership of that committee, there's overlapping membership of that all the way through the committees of the 60s into the academy studies, into the IPCC. So to me, it's kind of the beginning of formal committee processes looking at this stuff in a scientific way. And that takes you pretty quickly into committees in the early 60s that were when people first really clearly understood with the high quality radiative transfer measurements and the early GCM that quantitatively that CO2 would warm the climate, then essentially at exactly the same time in 63, 64, people began to think about deliberately offsetting that somehow by aerosols. And so you see some of that written up in the report to President Johnson in 65, and then kind of a continuous way that it was treated in panels after that. So I think of that advisory committee in 53 report as sort of the beginning of the modern professionalization of these topics.
And around that same time, well, in the 60s, there was an incident or a series of incidents that led to some of the earliest international environmental laws. Sikina, could you talk a little bit about the cloud seeding efforts of the US and Vietnam and some of the consequences for that?
Yeah, sure. Just to sort of put a fine point on some of what David implied in his discussion of cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is oftentimes conflated with solar radiation modification, but is quite different in terms of both intent and scale. So since this is a broad audience, I'll just start there and then kind of move into your question, Pete, if that's okay. So just to clarify that, cloud seeding is used oftentimes by local governments to catalyze precipitation, as David sort of alluded to in his comments. So it might be used for things like increasing snowpack for recreation or to increase spring snowmelt, to fill reservoirs for things like farming and drinking water. It might be used to decrease hail in advance of intense storms, to decrease risks of crop damage or property damage. Could be used by airports to decrease fog, these types of things. The example that you're pointing to, Pete, is in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the US used this strategy in Vietnam to do things like destroy roads, increase or trigger landslides, so using it to confer military advantage. And this raised a lot of concern internationally and catalyzed what was one of the first international attempts to think about governance in this space, which was the ENMOD Convention, also called the Environmental Modification Convention, or formally the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. And what ENMOD did was restrict any form of weather modification, which was defined in the treaty as any technique used to change the dynamics, composition, or structure of the Earth through the deliberate manipulation of natural processes. So there's sometimes kind of conversation in the field about whether NMOD might ever apply to SRM, but because it's limited in scope to hostile use and really targeted more at these weather modification as opposed to climate altering types of approaches, we generally think of it as not particularly relevant in its current form anyways.
Sikina, I've always wondered how much NMOD was a reaction to the cloud seeding that the US did over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which I suspect didn't do very much, although they might have thought it destroyed roads, but I don't know. But of course, the US was also putting a huge amount of defoliant on 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, what they called Agent Orange, that was probably much more destructive. I mean, I'm sure much more destructive on the ground. And I don't know to what extent NMOD was more a reaction to that than the weather. Do you
Yeah,
have any
that's
idea?
I don't know, and I haven't seen anything that has studied or looked at that, although I haven't looked for it actively. But I'm sure, David, that's a great point that this was, as with most things, multiple factors leading to the outcome as opposed to, one causal mechanism.
I mean, I
And it's
guess my last
interesting
one on
that
that, does spraying a defoliant at large does large scale destruction of forest cover or of tree of cover by spraying a defoliant count as environmental modification? I would, for hostile intent, I would sure think so, but I actually don't know.
Yeah, I'm
I
not
think it's
sure.
interesting that throughout this time, there are sort of like NATO groups and others looking specifically at environmental warfare in various other forms. And one of the things always found interesting about this is that the first use of ozone hole in the literature is in the
Mhm.
context of how could we make an ozone hole over someone else's territory, not this is a natural phenomenon. And in fact, quite a lot of the more, another thing for better historians than you or I, David, to trace at some point is the way in which the truly catastrophic understandings of what the environment can do have to some extent been anticipated or grown out of things about what we could do to other people through the environment.
Yeah.
Well, the rather grim part of the history of this topic. So I guess moving on from we're in the 60s now. I guess, David, you first got into the field in the late 80s, publishing maybe your first paper in 92. Can you take us forward from the 60s to around that time and how this field was developing and maybe also the attitude among climate scientists? Because this idea was out there, but it also kind of went into the background. Is that right?
Yeah, my impression is that I think it went to the background really with the rise of the IPCC and the kind of growing professionalization of climate and the involvement of kind of climate as an activist, serious concern following maybe the Montreal conference. So, the U.S. National Academy Committee of 82, 83 had a kind of frank chapter on this, and I've talked to some of the authors of that committee, and my sense is it wasn't that controversial then, but then it was becoming much more controversial already a decade later. So when I really started to get involved, it was partly because there was a write-up of a Academy committee that ended up publishing in 1990, if I remember the date right, or it's close to that. And so that review article that I wrote included material that had been developed for that Academy report. That Academy report had a really big chapter on climate engineering, but already with kind of obvious tensions and concerns about, well, it wasn't called moral hazard, but concerns about what we call moral hazard. So I'd say certainly starting then in the early 90s, there was more and more, I think, there's well-reasoned concern from people who were trying to get action to cut emissions that this would be a distraction from cutting emissions. And I'd say, early on in my career, as I was spending still a quite small amount of time on this, but I was doing at least some time on it in the 90s, I would get told by kind of wiser, older, I think mostly men in the climate science world that I shouldn't work on it either because it would be bad for my career or because it was just destructive to talk about it and we shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing from a few other colleagues of your generation that they were also warned off talking about this for sort of similar reasons. I guess any other reflections on that time period before we sort of move forward
Well, I
to
think I mean, the one, I mean, involves me, but I think it legitimately was historically important, and it's more about Ken Caldera. So there was this had been a wonderful series of meetings organized in Aspen under NASA funding that were interdisciplinary meetings on climate that were terrific. And one of them touched on climate engineering in '98. I was invited probably because I'd written that earlier article. And Ken Caldera was there as well. It could be the first time I met him. I don't recall. Anyway, Lowell Wood of nuclear weapons fame, protege of Ed Teller's, Lowell was speaking and explaining how wonderful climate engineering was and how it would solve all our problems. We shouldn't bother cutting emissions. And Lowell, I now know him a little better. He likes to debate liberals, and I think he was trying to debate liberals, and it worked, and we rose to the bait. And we, Ken and I, stood at the back. Some of this is actually in this film now, and explained how Lowell was wrong and how, because the top of the atmosphere radiative forcing looked quite different for CO2 and SAI, that it really wouldn't work the way he said. And that argument, the argument that it wouldn't work, actually goes back to stuff in the 1990 Academy report. So there were kind of a good set of rational reasons why we were sure SRM would cool global temperatures, but would inherently be very unequal. And then Ken went back to his lab and teamed up with Bala Govindasamy and wrote that first paper. I'm pretty sure, as I understand it, with the goal of kind of proving Lowell wrong, that is, proving that it wouldn't work very well. And in fact, what they found is the compensation was pretty good, which is sort of what all the climate models have found since.
Great. I'll just unpack a couple of acronyms. Solar radiation modification or sunlight reflection methods often get thrown into SRM. I'm not sure our audience will be familiar. Same with stratospheric aerosol injection getting shortened to SAI. But yes, just to jump in there. Great. Yeah, any other thoughts on this time before we move forward to Paul Crutzen?
Well, I think what David's was alluding to there is that when after that meeting in Aspen, Ken went back and thought, well, I'll show this with a computer model. I'll show that the forcing isn't equal and opposite, and so this will be inherently very unstable and unequal. And when he does that, both on his own and with Govindsamy Bala, he finds that no, it actually looks as though, to a first approximation, you can cancel out quite a lot of global warming with a reasonable amount of stuff put into the stratosphere. And that's one of the papers that Paul Crutzen, a great atmospheric chemist, and also, I think, a great scientific public intellectual. He's involved in many of the most important environmental debates of the late 20th century. Paul, in maybe his last major intervention in 2006, writes a paper about solar geoengineering in a context that's not explicitly really about carbon dioxide mediated climate change. It's about the question of sulfate aerosols in the lower stratosphere. Sulfate aerosols are little particles that are produced from sulfur emissions into the atmosphere, and they have two particularly germane effects. One is that they really screw up your lungs if you breathe in a lot of them. They are a major component of air pollution. They are also rather glittery, and they reflect away sunlight before it hits the surface, and they can also affect the makeup and properties of clouds. And so Paul says you have this policy dilemma, and this is still so real that I was actually writing about it in The Economist this week. It's still absolutely real 20 years almost to the day since Paul's paper was published. You have this dilemma that if you clean up the air and thus save a lot of lives, you are also heating up the planet. And it's in the context of that discussion that Paul says, well, maybe by putting a much smaller amount of aerosol into the stratosphere, you could get the benefits of cleaning up the large amounts of sulfate pollution in the lower atmosphere, what they call the troposphere, and at the same time not lose the cooling effect. And I must say, I'm still 20 years on, and despite, I think, having at least once actually asked Paul Crutzen about this, I'm still not entirely clear whether this was actually a proposal or whether it was a reductio ad absurdum and was meant to frighten us all out of the idea of solar geoengineering and get us more committed to carbon dioxide removal. But the paper is a brilliant piece of rhetoric for a number of reasons. One is that it casts it in the very real sense of this dilemma. What are you going to do? Either way, things are going to be bad. Another thing that it does is that because it's Paul Crutzen who's had the Nobel Prize for his work on the ozone layer, it implicitly says that the worries about the ozone layer, which always come with solar geoengineering in the stratosphere, because the particles in the stratosphere might catalyze the destruction of ozone, those problems, they may be real, but they should not ex ante be seen as a reason not to do this, because Paul Crutzen says it's okay to think about this. And that's really important, I think. It's one of the reasons why his colleagues are really keen that he should not write this. And the third thing, which I think is really brilliant rhetorically and also, true, is he points to ocean acidification, which is also something that Ken Caldeira was then working on, and says ocean acidification is bad. And even if solar geoengineering could do something about the climate effects of carbon dioxide, we would still have to reduce carbon dioxide because of ocean acidification. And that's another sort of I think the term would be permission structure, telling fellow scientists, this is not unthinkable. The arguments against this, there are ways, and they may not be politically feasible ways, but there are conceptual ways that you can imagine this being used in which it does not either stop action on carbon dioxide or give way to any other sort of or give way to an ozone catastrophe. And so I think it is, I think, an absolutely remarkable paper. And although it's true that there was a sort of swell of solar geoengineering discussion going on before that, it's happening at NASA Ames a bit around that time. It's happening. The Tyndall Centre in the UK has a meeting on it. It's definitely Paul Crutzen's paper that leads to 3 years later a big Royal Society report on the subject, and that sort of forms the modern take on the subject within the academy.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's worth mentioning Steve Schneider. So Steve Schneider was a brilliant and very flamboyant climate scientist who had himself published on climate engineering in the early 70s with Kellogg, a really early paper in Science. And he came to edit this journal called Climatic Change. He formed and edited this journal that was deliberately interdisciplinary. That's the journal that the Crutzen paper was published in. But Steve got a bunch of concerns from people about the fact that Crutzen was going to publish the paper, and Steve then commissioned a whole series of articles from a range of different viewpoints. He asked me to write one, and I decided I was too busy. I feel like a moron. But anyway, he had a whole bunch of different articles. And I think those articles helped to really seed the modern debate because Steve, in a sense, structured a debate by inviting a range of people to comment along with Crutzen's article that I think helped to amplify the article in a way and to launch many of the modern terms of the debate.
And Steve also completely overrode his own editorial board, as I understand it. The article is put in as an editorial essay. I think it's a format that I don't think the journal used ever before or since. It was Steve wanted to get it published. I don't think it was used before that, but that was what Steve told me anyway. But maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Steve certainly was. I'd say Steve made pretty unilateral decisions of that journal. But yeah, I think that there's no question that was a turning point. There were lots of conversations before that Tyndall Center meeting and others. And maybe of interest that the group that I was part of at Carnegie Mellon had got early large NSF funding for human dimensions of global change. So explicitly interdisciplinary and human from the NSF Social Science Directorate, I think their biggest grant ever. And that included work on the politics and public perception and so on of what we now call sunlight reflection. And that was also predated that, if I remember correctly. So there was some work beforehand, but then no question Crutzen accelerated it.
Great. And it broke out of the scientific world at some point. So Sikina, when did solar geoengineering get on the radar of international governance organizations? Can you give us a brief overview of how things have evolved since then?
Yeah, sure, Pete. I think I'll highlight 3 really important milestones in terms of sort of international governance in this space. And And the first was the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010 at their 10th Conference of the Parties, passed a decision that was largely in response to a slightly different issue, ocean fertilization, the removal of carbon from the atmosphere and storing in the oceans, where the parties to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, invited parties to refrain from engaging in geoengineering activities that would impact biodiversity. And a couple of really important things to note about this. So first is that parties were invited to do this. Oftentimes, this decision is inaccurately characterized as a ban or a moratorium, but the word invited is actually quite key here. They weren't required to do it. So this is more like a set of guidelines, of voluntary guidelines, really, than a legal ban or a moratorium on these practices. The other really important thing to note is that scientific research was carved out from this decision. So it wouldn't really impact SRM in that context either, although some folks mischaracterize it as such. The second important milestone I would highlight in this space is the treatment of this issue in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And the fifth assessment report, which began to be rolled out in 2013, shortly after that CBD decision in 2010, was for the first time, to my knowledge, the first time that SRM appeared in an IPCC assessment report. And
No, there was much earlier.
what was the first one, David?
I was a co-author along with Ready for It Haroon Khashoggi of Exxon New fame and Greg Marland, who had started the CO2 record. I think that's in the first or second IPCC. So there was definitely, yeah, that's the only one I've actually participated in writing.
Yeah, I did an analysis of this, which I'll send to you, where I kind of counted and looked at it over time. And I think even if it was addressed earlier, this was kind of the first time I would characterize it as somewhat significant, where it appeared, for example, in the summary for policymakers, where they talk about, they basically characterize limited evidence precludes a comprehensive assessment of the feasibility, the costs, et cetera, and environmental impacts. But I think the important point really to make here is that since that time, we've seen a really steady increase in treatment of SRM in the IPCC reports. So it also came out in as an important topic in the 2018 special report on 1.5 degrees, which expanded the conversation greatly in that forum. And then it's continued to come up in the assessment reports, including in AR6, the assessment report number 6, which started to be rolled out in 2021, and we're expecting an AR7 as well. The third milestone that I would note in the international governance sphere is 2 draft resolutions that were heard in 2019 and 2024 in the United Nations Environment Assembly. And in both of those cases, the resolution was withdrawn from the floor before it actually came for a vote. But I think they're quite significant nonetheless, because it's the first time we really see debate about SRM in an intergovernmental forum. So what was happening, or what happens in the IPCC, is quite different than what we're seeing in UNEA, where you have parties to the organization actually having conversations about political issues surrounding this topic. And I think they're important to note too, because they were quite modest in scope and in character. So these resolutions were quite similar. They asked for an assessment of knowledge. They asked for clear definition of terms. They asked to identify what are the existing governance mechanisms that are out there. And they were, in both cases, so controversial for a variety of reasons, including whether UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, is even the right forum in which to have these debates, that in both cases they were withdrawn from the floor before they came for a vote. And the last thing I'll say about the UNEA resolutions that I thought was quite interesting was that in 2024, at the 6th meeting, there was strong opposition from the African group to consideration of SRM within this forum. And this was reflective of some really interesting developments at the regional level a couple years prior, where the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, or AMCEN, at their 19th meeting in 2023, passed a decision calling for the non-use agreement, which maybe we'll get to it at some point in this conversation. And that call was then reaffirmed in 2025 at a subsequent meeting of that same group. So in addition to what's been happening in some of these international fora, we're also seeing some interesting activity at the regional level as well.
Well, let's bring up the non-use agreement. I mean, I'm going to turn the conversation open now because there's a lot of things that have happened in the field. We can't get to all of them, but how significant do the others here think the non-use agreement is? Which is there's a bit of an ambiguity here. There's a campaign by academics, and then there's the general notion of a non-use agreement. But how significant is that development?
Well, maybe I can sort of start us off by kind of explaining what it is and what it calls for, and then I can offer my thoughts on it. So in 2022, I believe there was an open letter as well as a corresponding article that was published in Wire's Climate Change, largely written by folks in my academic field, that called for 5 things. So they called for a non-use agreement that had 5 tenets. So the first was no deployment. The second was no intellectual property. The third was no outdoor experiments. The fourth was no public funding. And the fifth was no assessment in international institutions. And I think, circling back to your question about how important was the non-use agreement, I think it was important. I think it's been important in shaping the debate. I think some of the claims that proponents of that agreement and some of the claims that are put forth in the corresponding article make some good sense, and some of them are really problematic from my perspective. So, for me, the idea that assessment should not occur and international assessment should not occur is unacceptable and irresponsible. I think it has the potential to cause far more harm than good in terms of protecting against some of the concerns that proponents have about SRM. I think some of the claims about governability that come up in discussions and debates around the non-use agreement are also hard to support, in my view. I mean, there's claims that come up in the paper that SRM is inherently ungovernable. I don't understand actually that statement. I think, can we govern it perfectly? Probably not. Do we govern anything perfectly? Absolutely not. I mean, look at climate governance. Do we govern climate change perfectly? No. That's why we're in this mess to begin with. That's why we're having this conversation about SRM. So I think, it's been really important in raising and bringing to the fore some issues that have to be discussed surrounding justice, surrounding governance, but it's also created some barriers or roadblocks, I think, to the development of really basic governance structures that are, in my view, no-brainers for SRM, that are, that put guardrails around research, around potential deployment. And when I say that, that could mean eventually a ban or a moratorium. I'm not, advocating for advancing of this work necessarily. But there are things like transparency mechanisms that we don't have around research, around funding. There are things like international collaboration, mechanisms to enhance that could be built out through international governance, and many other things that are really the non-use agreement and the debates that have and sort of the hardline position, I would say, around the non-use agreement have really sort of placed barriers to our ability to move some of those basic tenets of governance forward.
Well, let me open up a bit beyond governance because we've covered that in quite a bit of depth now. What else would you point to as some of the major developments in the field?
Well, I'll say a few things there. I think a lot of the development has been the dog that didn't bark. I've been covering the field more or less. I mean, off and on before, but I've been thinking about it quite a lot since Crutzen, so now for about 20 years. And the idea that something show-stoppingly awful would turn up was quite real to begin with, and is now increasingly, I think, not real. And it's undeniably the case that you could implement solar geoengineering in ways that would be horribly harmful, but what you might categorize as sensible uses of solar geoengineering, I think I think, they have not proved to have very strong side effects. And I think, Kate Rickey's work showing that the winners and losers problem is not as bad as it had sometimes been put before that. The work by Ben Kravitz and Doug McMartin and others showing that you could actually have a responsive system that at least worked within the confines of a GCM. I think those are, and indeed, work that you and David did, Pete, show on the effect on tropical storms. I think these are really interesting steps forward. I think the problem. I mean, I think the other. For me, one of the bigger intellectual things that's happened in that time was the Marty Weitzman work on with Gernot Wagner on free drivers, which speaks much more to the governance issues. This is the idea that solar geoengineering is so cheap in terms of the material costs of doing it, and we could come back to whether that's a true perception or not, that if it were to be started, you would get the amount of it you would get would be the amount wanted by the person who wanted the most, subject to constraints of sort of like absolute termination by other people. And that's something I hadn't really thought. That struck me as something. Took me a couple of years to really get it into my thinking about solar geoengineering, and I think it's been one of the more important developments in the field.
I agree with that. I think I think the dog that didn't bite, as Oliver characterized it, is in many ways the most important thing. That is, I and many other people talked about novel environmental risks, and we used to talk about how risky this was. And I think the last quarter century now, a little more, since that paper of Bala and Ken's, has in fact produced almost nothing in the way of novel environmental risks. And that's despite, I think, an entirely healthy but real bias on the part of the environmental science community to try and find problems, which, to be clear, I think that's healthy because there are a long history of problems with environmental interventions. Any environmental intervention will, I'm sure, produce some unexpected and bad side effects. But the fact that largely we found that if we're talking about hemispherically balanced, relatively moderate amounts of even SAI, we're just not finding in peer-reviewed papers serious, certainly not novel impacts. I think that really is the important thing. So what we have is senior climate scientists making claims, statements in the press about big impacts, but they don't publish things showing that. And I think that absence of papers that show clear problems of moderate SAI, especially novel problems, really is the biggest news.
Is there another dog that didn't bark? In that the big fear around this was that it would be embraced by the climate denying right, that this would be the perfect excuse to not cut emissions. And I've seen very little. I mean, there's maybe been a few hints of it, but I've seen very little embracing of this. Any thoughts on that?
Might be that it's too early. I still think we're all in the prehistory. So, kind of maybe connecting with what Oliver has said. I think right now this is in this little tiny, um, little inbred community, and we don't yet have any national governments that have had serious, high-level, kind of cabinet-level debates about what their interests are in this regard. And if it is correct that the interests are much more in the global south that suffers most from heat to do this, and perhaps there's actually interest in the global north not to do it, which is what just the kind of first order reading of the climate impacts would suggest is the way interests look, then we may see a really different structure and also different structure involving the fossil fuel rich nations if it becomes more real. So I think we, in some sense, haven't seen actual revealing of countries' real interests and positions yet.
I think, and that should bring me on to something that I was thinking when I was talking about the changes that had happened before, Pete. I was thinking quite strongly in the sort of like framework of the 2010s, and one of the changes since then has been, and largely through and I don't say this in a self-congratulatory way because I just sort of like sit in the background and occasionally mutter sage advice. But the work that Andy Parker and the team at Degrees have done, which has brought a lot of, really a lot of Global South researchers who wanted to work on solar geoengineering, we've been able to give them the funds to do something along those lines. And that's been responsible for building up a level of technical expertise and also local resources for policymakers and the policy curious in the Global South, which I think is absolutely vital. And I'd like to hear Sikina on this, because it seems to me that in a just world, when we're talking about the influences of justice and the discourse on justice becoming in the context of the non-use agreement, in a just world, the interests of the Global South, the interests of the 40% of the planet that lives in the tropics, and the people and the part of the planet that is neither Europe nor America, those interests should be paramount, and it's really important that they be brought into a general discussion, not on one side or another, but in fact more or less as the dominant voice in and of themselves.
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that, Ollie. I agree 100%. There have been several analyses that have sort of looked at the justice dimensions of this in the scientific literature. A recent one that I did with one of my former PhD students, Zach Dove, looked at sort of publications and scientific publications over time, finding that more than 90% of all, and when I say scientific, I mean broadly, so academic publications, more than 90% of that work comes from and is done by researchers based in North America and Europe. And of course, as you pointed to, when we look at the distribution of climate impacts, overlay that with climate responsibility in terms of historic emissions, there's a big mismatch, and the Global South is drastically underrepresented in that literature and capacity. And I agree with you that the work that Andy Parker has done through the Degrees Initiative is absolutely transformational and critically important. I've had the chance to participate in at least one of their meetings a year or two ago, and just even participating in that one meeting has, for me, yielded several collaborators in the Global South who I'm now working on projects with, and it's been really fantastic. So yes, and obviously the work is much broader than that. I would also highlight other NGOs that are doing amazing work in this space, as the DSG, Suchi Talati's organization, the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, where they're doing amazing work across the globe, doing capacity building with NGOs and policymakers largely, to build capacity for governance. So whereas Degrees is doing a lot of work in terms of building capacity for research, DSG's done some really amazing parallel work raising capacity for governance. So to circle back to Pete's question about some of these emerging issues and what's happening now, it's really exciting. I think both of those groups are doing fantastic work and needs to be enhanced and amplified as we move forward. And in our pre-conversation about this talk or this meeting, David, you mentioned some of the other big environmental NGOs that are entering the space, and seeing them is really important. I was really curious and hoping that you'd have a chance to say a little bit more about your thoughts on that, if you're willing.
Sure. I mean, in the US and Canada, where I know the most, but my sense is there's similar dynamics in some of the Western European democracies. I'd say over the years, lots of people in the kind of scientific technical core of the climate and climate science world have been inclined to fund research on this, but there's been the government people higher up have tended to block or restrain funding out of concern that the environmental movement would push back or attack them. And there's sort of some basic political reality that if you're in government, you're always giving things to different constituencies, and you don't give this is fundamentally an environmental thing, and you don't give a thing to the environmental constituency if it's mostly going to just get you trouble. So I think that's kind of been the political dynamic that stopped public funding. Obviously not completely, there has been public funding, but slowed it down. And so I think having some of the biggest in the US anyway, the the environmental NGOs that have the biggest track record on issues of climate and air pollution, maybe the two most important of them all, NRDC and EDF, certainly among the very most important, now both explicitly and publicly support research and have their executive directors talking explicitly and positively about it. That feels like a really big change. Of course, that's US and not Europe. I can say in Canada, we're, I think, inching towards the same thing. Not quite so public, but I'd say we're pretty much in the same situation. Europe, I think there's certainly are some NGOs speaking publicly, but not the big ones as far as I know. But I think that dynamic, political dynamic, is crucially important.
Yeah.
I think I'd add to that, the NGOs are not the only fruit. We've seen in the last couple of years two big changes in the ecosystem of solar geoengineering research. And one has been a large investment by an arm's length government body in the UK, a rather strange body called ARIA. And I say they're rather strange with the fondness of someone who gets research fund or degrees gets research funding from them. But it is interesting because their priorities are theirs to set. They're not necessarily the priorities of the government of the day. And they've put a significant amount of investment into the idea of cooling the climate in various different ways. And the amount of pushback has been, I think, relatively slight. The other thing that's happened, and I think it's just too soon to know how big a thing this is the appearance of Stardust Solutions, which is an Israeli-American startup which has raised $75 million to produce and test very specific types of aerosol for deployment, presumably in the stratosphere, by party or parties unknown. I was very interested to be able to talk to some of them at a meeting that David convened in Chicago recently. I think the sense of what that means for the field is still somewhat nascent. There's obviously, among other things, a lot of researchers have significant worries about research that comes from people previously backed by the IDF, because this comes out of the Israeli atomic energy research process. So there's a lot of, I don't need to tell anyone else, there's a lot of politics there, but there's also this question of $75 million is more by quite a long way than any philanthropy has ever put into solar geoengineering research. And so what that does to the sort of research that happens and to the public perception of that research, I think is going to be something really interesting to follow over the next year.
Yeah.
Let me just jump in on that. I mean, so I guess something we haven't quite touched on yet is doing stuff in the real world. We've talked a lot about research, a lot about governance, but with ARIA and with Stardust, they're proposing field experiments that have been some of the things that have attracted some of the biggest attention in this field and potentially the developing of technology. None of this has actually been deployed at scale yet, but when things go outdoors, they attract a lot of attention. So any thoughts on field experiments and the discussion around those and how that should shape the history of the field?
David, would you like to talk about the elephant in your room?
Not that much. I think it
I can
takes
do
a
it very
longer
quickly then.
conversation to do it because I think there's some real differences of opinion about what happened. But obviously, field experiments became one of the things that opposition around the general idea of sunlight reflection organized around. Whether or not that ended up accelerating or decelerating progress is unclear. I'd say that it's certainly wrong to think that one needs experiments to go ahead and begin deployment. Yeah, I don't have much more to say.
Well, just to be clear for those who aren't familiar, you were involved in the ScopeX project, which was planning to conduct an outdoor field experiment, which was cancelled after some incidents. Well, not incidents, after some reaction, and was
Well,
pulled.
and this is where we're all going to quickly get into different views about what happened. But I don't
But just
think
for
we have
those who are
time for
unfamiliar with the very basics, yeah.
Maybe I can just offer one without talking about any specific experiment, but just kind of a high level thought about sort of outdoor experiments and the relationship to governance, which is, there have been, 3 or 4-ish attempts so far at outdoor experimentation in this space. And in each of those instances, including the REF-funded projects that Ollie referred to, there's sort of experiment level or there's not public governance around it, right? So there's governance that's emerged in the case of SPICE, in the case of ScopeX, in the case of the RE experiments, that are ad hoc and variable. And this creates a lot of problems, I think, both for researchers and for the public, because the mechanisms of participation are unclear, the expectations for engagement are unclear. And I think, if we can agree that some sort of governance is necessary, and I'm not sure we can, that's certainly my position, that governance of outdoor experimentation is necessary, then it really needs to be standardized and centralized in some way so that there's predictability both for those who are trying to do the work, but also those who want to engage in conversations or in influencing how this type of work proceeds in the broader kind of public sphere.
So I don't agree with Sikina's view that there wasn't any public governance. So, for example, in Sweden, we'd gone through a formal process with the Swedish government, which they approved. There are lots of different checks and balances, as there should be, on what experimenters do. In the US, there's a broad coverage under NEPA and a set of other rules. What Sikina is, I believe, suggesting, she can correct me, is that there be a whole separate set of rules which are not tied to environmental risk, but are tied to the topic, which I believe is unusual, almost unprecedented, and would be very hard to implement. And I think in some deep way kind of illiberal. I am strongly in favor of the fact that experimenters should never get to be in charge of managing the assessment of the risks, the human health and safety or environmental risks of what they do, but there are already structures that more or less set that up, that are in place. I am not persuaded that it makes sense to have a centralized way to manage things based on topic or idea, which I believe is effectively what Sikina is suggesting, because I believe that would tend to inevitably encourage a kind of groupthink, which is exactly what weakens the credibility of science.
I mean, this is a very deep topic, and this is why you didn't necessarily want to get into it. Something we'll come back to later, I'm sure. It's a challenging area where there is
Could I come into it from a slightly different angle and very quickly, Pete?
Very briefly.
One of the things that I like about the idea of outdoors work is that one of the things that worries me about solar geoengineering as an intellectual subject is, although the modeling community has done great work on this, and the work that we do at Degrees is model based, except for the social and political stuff we do, which isn't. I think that it's quite striking how the wider intellectual currents in climate change science aren't really reflected in the community doing solar geoengineering, because it is dominated by model results at the moment, and that's great in many ways, but it does mean I was very struck. I've just been writing a big piece for The Economist on the Earth's energy imbalance. And this is a subject that's very closely connected to questions about solar geoengineering. But the theoretical people in that and the level of discourse, these people are not involved in the social geoengineering discussions. Those tend to happen, sort of like not in private, but certainly among consenting adults. And they have not become a sort of like mainstream part of how other climate scientists think. And that, I think, is something of a disappointment to me over the last 20 years.
Well, because we're running very much out of time, I'd like to move on to our questions and try and get a couple in at least from our audience before most of our panelists need to leave. So I'll hand over to Dave now, who's been collecting these.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to the panelists. Very interesting discussion of the history here. I'm going to start with sort of a combination of a few people's things. A couple of you were talking about the early history of sort of weather modification and its influence sort of in the field. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that sort of conflation with weather modification and geoengineering, given the recent efforts in the US to ban both, or sometimes any of the above, in a number of states. So I'm just curious if there are lessons from history that you might apply to what we're seeing with some of those bans. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I would just say that the lessons of history I would like to see applied in the United States at the moment are not those lessons from history. And it seems to me to be an almost entirely marginal question. I mean, it's interesting that there is this MAGA concern about the purity of our precious heavenly fluids. But
Bodily fluids to you.
well, when they're up in the air, they're heavenly, right?
Okay.
Okay. But yes, I mean, I think it is concerning in itself, but it is part of something about which I'm so much more concerned about on other grounds that I don't really give it that much thought.
Agreed.
Okay, moving on then. One of the things we were maybe going to talk through also, and this is again sort of combining a couple of questions, how do you all see sort of this conversation in a number of years from now? What can we learn from the history of SRM and in terms of looking forward to the future? Obviously, this is impossible to do with any sort of specificity because we don't know what is going to happen. But how do you imagine a conversation of this history would go in any number of years from now that you want to say, 10 years, 50 years, whatever you think? This is a speculative space.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in briefly. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's sort of about where do you see the field going in X number of years. So I sort of fell into this field by accident, and have, after many years working on climate governance. And the reason I stay is because we're failing. We're failing, and the climate governance sphere has not, in the quarter century that I've been working on it, made significant progress. And we're in a time where, do I wish we lived in a world where we were thinking about SRM? No, but unfortunately, I think we need to be thinking about every type of creative solution and potentially ruling it out. But ultimately, I think that no matter what I think about SRM or what anyone thinks about SRM, it's coming down the pike. And burying our head in the sand and blocking governance efforts to minimize what might be disastrous development and or use is irresponsible. So for me, I'm motivated by the fear that SRM is scary, but what's scarier is living in a world with ungoverned SRM. And so I think we've tried to create governance in an anticipatory way in this space. We haven't done very well. We have, private actors who are doing things that, Ollie mentioned with Stardust a little earlier, lobbying governments to do the job for us. And that to me is pretty terrifying. And so, where do I think the field will be in 20 years or so? I think if we follow the same governance pathway that we're on, we'll continue to be in a world where powerful actors are calling the shots. And, as related to if and how we scale up this technology, and existing inequities will continue to deepen across the globe. So, not to end on a sour or sad note, but I'm not particularly optimistic about the future of this space.
Maybe the first thing I would offer is that we might be the wrong people to answer your question. So there's this really interesting evidence from Tetlock and these people who've worked on the kind of quality of forecasting that suggests that people closer to a field do a worse job. So, I mean, there's no question, technically, I and the other panelists here know much more about SRM than some random person you talk to. We're all experts. But in terms of like guessing what's going to happen over the next 20 years, I really have no confidence in my ability to answer that at all. And I think actually somebody who's a little further removed might do a better job. I think what we can say with confidence is the kind of near-term trajectories. There's no question that, over the last year or two, there's been a dramatic acceleration of the way it's tackled in quite kind of high-level policy circumstance. So I think that's real, but trends can stop. I think it is also important to come down to big interests. And I think a place where Sikina and I might feel differently is I think it's sort of axiomatic. The world is governed by people with more power. That's what it means to have power. But I think that this is a technology that it seems could be applied by a very wide range of countries. And it seems that the countries most motivated to apply it will be, in general, the ones who are harmed the most. And so I think there's some sort of technologies that seem to me most likely to exacerbate power inequalities. And I don't overall see this as one of those.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really have enjoyed this discussion. I'm just going to come up with a bit of housekeeping. We're at the hour, so I'd like to thank the panel and everybody in the audience for joining. We may have a couple more minutes at the end if there are any more questions to answer.
Could I just come in on?
Discussion will be on SRM and India. Sign up to our email list to hear more and our newsletters. And we'll also soon be publishing the first edition of our letters to the editor. So if you'd like to share thoughts on this discussion, other content or recent developments, please email us a short letter at questions@srm360.org. And with that, I'll hand back to Pete and the panel.
Well, I believe most of our panel needs to leave now, but Ollie, who didn't get his last word in, can stay around for a few more minutes.
I can be very quick on this, I think, because not one thing, but three things about where we might be in 50 years. We might be in people saying, why the hell did they do this? We might be in people saying, why the hell didn't they do this? And we might be there with people saying, okay, we've done this. What are we going to do next? I think that's basically the way it is. It's either an opportunity cost, or it's a disaster, or it's something that people are muddling through with.
Well, on that note, thanks to our panel. Great to have Sikina Jinnah, David Keith, and Oliver Morton joining us for this whistle-stop tour of the history of solar geoengineering. Thanks all.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks very much.